Mistrust of science and scientific institutions has become a big topic of discussion, especially after the pandemic. And we get those questions all the time. Can we trust science? Can we trust scientists? Conflicts of interest, industry influence, etc. In my opinion, the best way to address concerns is to talk about them openly. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. So I got the chance to talk with one of the leading experts on scientific fraud, Dr. Elisabeth Bik. Elisabeth has a PhD in microbiology and was a researcher at Stanford before she gave up her job to spot inaccuracies and fraud in scientific studies full-time. She has developed a reputation as a science fraud detective, a sort of a Sherlock Holmes of scientific misconduct. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, New Yorker magazine, and the journal Nature, among many other outlets. In our conversation, she really pulls back the curtain on this dark side of science that few people get to see. We talked about the scope of the problem, psychological aspects that lead some scientists to commit fraud, solutions to prevent the problem in the future, and how to make sense of it all. Elisabeth has received a number of awards, but as you might imagine, she's also made some enemies along the way due to her exposés. In fact, she's been persecuted and viciously attacked for her work. I think you'll agree with me that her bravery really shines through in our conversation and that we're really lucky to have her. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Dr. Elisabeth Bik.
Nothing makes you mad as seeing an image, or seeing, in this case, a sentence that somebody had stolen, a sentence that I had written. So it all started with me hearing about plagiarism and just, expecting nothing out of it. I just took a sentence that I had written, put it between quotes into Google Scholar, and to my surprise, there were other hits than just my paper, and there were two papers, and it was actually like one chapter and one paper written by the same group that had used my sentence, and not just my sentence and a couple of other sentences, but sentences by many other people. So the whole article was one patchwork of plagiarized text, sort of copy pasted together to create a Frankenstein monster that looked like a review paper, but there was nothing or very little novel about it. It was just regurgitated paragraphs written by other people without giving credit also. So it was that made me mad, and that's like I've said in other interviews, I'm still powered by the anger that I felt that day. And because and then later I switched to image duplication because by another coincidence I discovered I was working on a PhD thesis that had plagiarized text, and it also turned out to have a duplicated image, and that image I could recognize because it has a very distinct little spot, and it had been used in 2 chapters, and both of these chapters were later published as scientific papers, peer-reviewed, and these duplications were not detected. And so there were several, not just one, were several duplications in the Western blots, so protein blots that were used in that PhD thesis. And then I realized I should work on image duplication, because that is even more important. For me, plagiarism made me mad, but image duplication to cheat in science made me even more mad. So I switched.
Yeah, it is more egregious. It sounds like it takes more guts to do that, more like more audacity to try to get away with it. It's terrifying. Like I was hearing you talk about finding your writing in other papers, and I was like, man, I gotta try to Google my papers and see if I can pull up any of that. I've never tried that.
You should do it. You should do it. It's who knows what you'll find.
I'm kind of scared to do
and
it.
it could mean a career switch like it did for me.
Right. So you ended up quitting your job in full-time research and doing this full-time, this fraud detection or integrity inspecting.
Right. Yeah. I first was working at Stanford doing the image duplication and first the plagiarism searches as a hobby, like in the weekends, in the evenings. And I still had a full-time job in research. And I also worked 2.5 years in biotech at 2 different companies. And one day I realized at a dinner party, I was talking about my regular work at the biotech company. And then I was talking about my image duplication detective work. And I realized, hey, I sound much more enthusiastic when I talk about my hobby than my real work. I should just do that full time and take the jump and, maybe work as a consultant. But let's do it for a year. I quit my job. I see if I can make a consulted living out of my new knowledge, my expertise in images. And if that is sustainable, I can do it for a longer time. And it turned out it was sustainable. So I quit my job, and that was 3 years ago. I'm still doing that full time.
So take us a little bit through your process. How do you come about? I follow your Twitter account. I see these fascinating examples. How do you find these? I don't know if they're needles in a haystack, but how do you go through the ocean of scientific literature to find these duplications and these manipulations? Like, take us a little bit through your process.
I started doing a systematic search. So that's what a couple of years ago, I searched 20,000 papers. I included 40 different journals. They all had to include the term Western blot, which is how I enriched for papers with photos. So that part I did in a systematic way. And that set of papers led to finding 800 papers with duplications. And I'm sort of still working off that initial set. So whenever you find a paper with, let's say, a manipulated photo, it is worthwhile to check other papers by those authors. The first author, the last author, maybe some authors in between. And sometimes that leads to new finds. So I have, 800 leads already that could lead to, thousands of more leads. So I do that occasionally, but currently I'm working off of tips. So people send me a tip like, can you look at this paper? Can you look at the works of this particular scientist? Because I think that is a shady lab. And in some cases, I don't really see the problem. There might be a problem, but it goes beyond what I can find. And but if it's an image problem, I can usually quickly tell if I agree or don't. And so if I don't agree, then that's over. But if I do agree, that could by itself lead to another set of papers. So it's a hairball. You find one paper, you find 10 more. And I see other people working on other papers. And so it's often, there's always enough work. It's like, I will never run out of work.
But it's essentially, then it's kind of manual, right? You go through the pictures one by one, you actually look at them, you detect these things by eye. You don't have some kind of software that does this automatically. There's no AI involved, nothing like that.
No, nowadays there is actually, but the initial set of 20,000 papers, I did scan all by eye. I didn't have software. I mean, I use software to draw my squares around, like this part looks the same as that part. But at that time, I did not have any software to help me. I found everything by eye and memory. But nowadays I use Image Twin, which is a software that is actually AI based. The beauty of the program is that it's very fast. I can drag a PDF into the software and it will extract all the images, compare them against each other, but also it will compare them against the database of publicly available papers. So I'm not quite sure how big that database is. Sometimes, of course, it finds hits with itself, so you can exclude that. And then that has led to some surprising findings. I would never find a duplication across papers. Yeah, the most common ones are microscopy photos of cells or tissues, or Western blots or DNA gels sometimes. That is also, those are pretty common photos that you might find in scientific papers. So scientific papers don't always have photos. So they might have line graphs or tables or formulas or whatever, but photos are fairly common in molecular biology type of paper. So that's why my searches are enriched for that. And it's also my background. I have a background in molecular biology. So I have more trouble understanding, I don't know, an NMR spectrum or so. But I have found duplications in plots like NMR spectra and flow cytometry images, which are collections of dots. So, and I've also found duplications in photos of mice or rats, like animals, or plants. So all kinds of things I can find. But the photos of gels and tissues and cells and so are the most common.
To me, one thing that strikes me when I see these pictures that you detect is the laziness of just duplicating the picture. I mean, if I was to do something like this, something this, this unethical, and also this damaging for you for one's career,
Mhm.
at least, I don't know, take a picture of a different area of the slide, right? That would be essentially undetectable. But no, they have to use the same picture, just like slightly nudged over or like slightly
Right.
rotated. It's so weird. Like, why would you do it that way? Just
Well, I think you're raising a very critical issue. I can only find the tip of the iceberg. What you just said, why don't you move your sample under the microscope a little bit farther and don't leave an overlap for Elisabeth Bik to find? That probably happens. I mean, most scientists are pretty smart, and they have to realize that if you do leave an overlap, it can be found even after your paper has been published. 20 years from now, somebody's going to look at it and going to find it. It would be much better if you don't leave any traces. So I'm convinced that the 4% of duplications that I'm finding in the scientific literature, and half of those we believe were done intentionally. So let's say 2% of misconduct, I believe that's really the tip of the iceberg. The real percentage of misconduct, deliberately changing results, and not just in photos, but in tables or line graphs or formula or whatever you can think of data sets in scientific papers, the real amount of fraud must be much higher than the 2% I'm finding.
It would be like that picture of the airplanes with the holes in the
Exactly.
wing.
That's a very good analogy, because people interpret it first wrongly and then they're like, oh, wait,
Yeah.
it's the other way around. Yes.
Right.
Okay, got it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really only the ones that leave marks that I can find. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I saw that. So 4% is your estimate so far of papers with issues, let's say in general, and you estimate that
Right.
half of those would be mistakes and half would be intentional.
Yeah, it's a rough estimate. And for an individual paper, it's hard to tell. Let's say if you have a paper, usually we say if a paper has a duplicated panel, so there's two panels that represent two different experiments, but they're the same photo, exact same photo, no shift or duplication or no rotation or so, then we usually assume it's an honest error. I mean, it could have been done deliberate, but yeah, okay, let's say that. And then if a paper has an image with duplicated elements like cells or parts of tissue, then we'll assume it was done deliberately. That seems like a fair comparison. And then the middle category is sort of where there's an overlap, or there's two images. One is rotated or shifted or mirrored, or just overlapping. Let's say if you have one of those problems in a paper, maybe it could be an honest error, but if it's 2 or 3 or 4, now I'm starting to become very suspicious. And even if it wasn't done intentionally, that is so super sloppy that you would not want to base your research on that paper. So I feel as a scientist, we should work diligently. We should keep track of our experiments and know at the end of the day which experiment is what, and label things correctly. That is part of doing good science. And so if you're not even able to keep track of your samples, 1 or 2 switches, sure, that can happen. But yeah, if it becomes too much, then it becomes a paper that you can no longer rely on.
Yeah. Just to clarify, the one you said is definitely manipulation would be if the image is altered. Is that right?
Yes. So if within an image you see duplicated cells, so one photo, let's say you look at a photo of a dinner party and you see Uncle Larry photoshopped in twice, like you see 2 Uncle Larrys, you see like this extra, the missing person at the party, you Photoshop them in, or you see actually two of the same persons in the same photo. That is unexpected, let's say, and that is unless Uncle Larry has a twin brother. So there might be a technical issue explaining that, but it's much more likely that it was photoshopped in. So I've seen photos of nanoparticles, for example. There's one photo I usually show at when I give talks, and it's the same 3 nanoparticles just copy pasted many times, and it's just once you see it, it's just so photoshopped. It's very obviously not the photo that was initially obtained, and I don't know why they did it. They wanted to show more nanoparticles than the 3 that were on the initial photos or so, and they just photoshopped them. But yeah, that's just you know, I don't know what they did to make that photo, but that was not the photo that was obtained.
Yeah, I get it. So it was something where it was clearly photoshopped, altered, duplicated within the same images. It can't just be somebody mistakenly used the same image twice in different experiments where it was supposed to be two different ones. This is like the same image. There's
The
duplication.
same photo, yeah,
Yeah,
within the
photocopying and
same photo, yeah.
manipulation of the image.
Yes, yeah. And sometimes we see Western blots or photos of cells or tissues where you see sort of a halo around the band. The band of interest has an area around it that has a different background than the rest of the photo. And that also suggests that it was copied in. And then sometimes the author will say, oh, that was just a piece of tape, but it is always around the band, right? It's not like on a random spot in the blot. It's always around a very interesting band that you know, there's an arrow like, look at this band. This is the essential part of the experiment. And that's where there's a halo around. And you don't always see that. You have to crank up the contrast a little bit, but then you might see that one band does not appear to have come from that area, that same gel, and yeah, that suggests manipulation. So it's technically not a duplication, but a manipulation. And those, if well done, you would never find them. But if they leave a halo around the band, yeah, then I could definitely ask questions about that.
What's your perception of maybe the psychology behind it, or what are the instances or the circumstances that lead to this happening? Does this happen at the level of a desperate graduate student who doesn't know, what he's doing is a moment of desperation, or does this go all the way up to the PI? Like, what's going on for this to come about?
I think it can be all of the above. Like the main driver is the pressure to publish, right? We, as scientists, we're expected to publish papers, and we're expected to publish novel, new, exciting, interesting findings. And if an experiment doesn't yield a novel and exciting finding, it is very tempting, especially now with digital photography, which has been now around for, let's say, 20 years or so. But before that, we brought our films to the photographer in the institution. You could not really Photoshop anything. But nowadays, it's so easy to take a photo with your smartphone of something, and then, or a camera maybe attached to a microscope, and then later adapt the results to make them look better. And that will allow a scientist to maybe publish in a scientific paper, or publish in a better impact factor scientific paper. So that is sort of one thing. But then I also think it depends. Like, there are, bad apples. There are graduate students who are desperate and just want to have a paper and get out of the lab. And then there are also, I feel, labs where the lab head, the director or the professor, is a bully who doesn't really want to hear no. And if he or she has a particular hypothesis in their head, and the graduate student comes to them with results that are not matching that, then they will they might tell the graduate student, well, that's not the result I wanted. I can hire another postdoc, or I can hire another graduate student. And if you imagine in the US, you're on a visa, if you're fired, then you have to, your sponsorship ends immediately, right? You have to leave the US and go back to your home country. So, and I'm sure there's other countries with similar rules. So it's a very threatening situation to be threatened to be fired, because that, you have to pack up all your stuff and leave the country within a couple of days. So I think in a situation like that, people might be desperate. And I, just saw a documentary about a case that I worked also on, about a professor who created an atmosphere of fear to the point where almost nobody from that institution wanted to talk to the reporters, because they were all super afraid to talk badly about this guy. He still has so much power over them.
When I was in grad school, sometimes this would pop up, these cases of fraud at a lab, and the papers start getting retracted, and there's this huge scandal. It didn't happen often. It was pretty rare, but when it happened, it was this massive scandal. Everybody talked about it, and the individual had such a stigma. I mean, their career was over. They were fired, couldn't get another job. So in addition to the incredulity of seeing people do this and think, well, how could they? Because it's against everything we we hold dear in science. It's almost, to me, feels analogous to in sports when somebody's caught doping, right? Getting where the rest of the athletes are so angry that they are cheating everybody else, not just against the spirit of the sport. And in science is kind of like that, even more so because the responsibility of improving human life, and then here's somebody who's just corrupting the entire system for their own benefit. But the part that I always found was really strange is that this is almost career suicide, because if you are publishing something that doesn't have a lot of impact, then why do it? And if it does have a lot of impact, very soon somebody's going to try to replicate it and discover that there's something wrong. So I never understood even the strategy of doing something like this. It always seemed dumb, even leaving ethics aside.
It's probably because the chance of getting caught is extremely low. So the retractions that we see are people who were caught, but I think, and recently the number of retractions has gone up enormously. And so I think there's a growing acceptance that some papers have misconduct and we should retract them. But I think until a couple of years ago, it was very rare that a paper got retracted. And it seemed that a lot of people have actually been protected, have been immune for retractions, even though everybody sort of knew that that was, some fishy things were going on there. But maybe similar to the Me Too movement, where, it was sort of accepted that if a person of genius did something else bad, then that, he was sort of protected against being reprimanded. And so I do feel there's a growing inacceptance of an intolerance of science misconduct. So there's more retractions. And there's also a growing number of misconduct cases. I believe that's definitely true. We see, for example, paper mills have created large numbers of completely made up papers that are being retracted in large waves. So that is one thing. And and I think if you work with a system where the rewards are very high, if you do misconduct, you make your results look better, you have a higher chance of getting, farther in your career and getting a paper in Nature or whatever. That is all great. But if at the same time, so the rewards are high, but the punishment, the chance of being caught and the punishments are very low, I think you create an atmosphere when people feel, we could cheat like everybody cheats. And I think that is sort of what has been going on. And to come back to your sports analogy, in sports, in let's say the Tour de France, it was sort of for a long time, everybody knew that doping was a thing, but there was not much being done about it. And then suddenly there seemed to be this change in attitude where then somebody said, I don't know if it was one person or sort of a gradual inacceptance of doping. And then suddenly, people lost medals because it all turned out that there was a lot of doping cases going on, and it became unacceptable. There was much more testing, and so that I think we're going through this inacceptance of doping phase now in science.
So let's get more into this aspect of dealing with. You talked about the people being protected and all this institutional side of things. Let's talk a bit more about that. On one hand, your experience contacting editors when you find these problems. Maybe we'll start with that, because is that the first thing that you do, is talk to the editors first and then the authors maybe later?
Not anymore, but that's how what I did a couple of years ago. So when I first did that scan of 20,000 papers and I found 800 papers with problems, I wrote to the editors-in-chief of these 40 different journals that I searched in, and sort of expecting, a nice answer and somebody actively looking into these cases. So after 5 years later, and sending them a reminder, I made up the balance. What happened to these 800 papers? And unfortunately, in 2/3 of the cases, nothing had happened. There was no retraction, no correction, no expression of concern, nothing. So the papers were still out there with their duplications. And so I'm sort of switching, like I'm still occasionally writing to editors, but I'm like, this is not working. Like I'm doing my best here and nobody seems to care. Well, that's maybe a bit dramatic, but it seemed that, in the majority of the cases, there was no action. So what's the point? What I really want to do is alert the readers. There's a big problem with this paper. If you are looking for a new hypothesis or a new line of research, be aware that with this particular paper, there is a problem. And, you know, I don't want to get people fired or have papers retracted maybe as my end goal, but to warn the reader. So I'm posting on Papier. That's my current mode of action. Every paper that I found, I immediately post on Papier. And so that allows people who have the Papier plugin, and it's a little extension that works in your browser. If you then do a literature search and that paper comes up in your search, it will show a green banner that there's a Papier plugin and you can click on it. So that's, I feel, the best way I can do for the reader. They are warned that there's a problem with a paper. And it's also very fast, because hunting down editors-in-chief and then sending them a reminder, and then you get an auto reply, you know, we're out of the office until the end of the week. And then you never hear back. It's like, that's my answer, I guess. And it's hard to keep track of all of that when I have now over 6,000 papers to sort of handle still. And it's just too much work. I just post them on Papier and hope for the best, that people at least can then be aware that there's a problem with that paper.
Yeah, that sounds really frustrating, that you had to go do their work of fact checking, and now you have to chase them to fix something that's your responsibility to fix. It's really exasperating. And I know that from some of the stories I've heard and read about in your interviews, that this experience with the editors of sometimes being ignored is a lot better than some of the experiences you had with some authors, where they get antagonistic, right? They don't just ignore, but they actually go on the offensive and attack the messenger.
Yes.
And go try to go ad hominem at you, instead of worrying about what their work that might exist with their work, as if it's your fault that something's wrong.
It's my fault. Yeah, no, everything is my fault. Yeah. No, it sort of tells me if an author can disprove my concerns, so it can take away my concerns by showing an original blot and saying, hey, you know, I agree, they look similar, but here are the original photos. Or, yeah, we made a mistake. Sorry, we're going to post a correction. You're absolutely right. Those are lovely responses, you know. Or if an author says, oh, that's not good, I'll look into this, but then never hear back from them. That at least would also be appreciated. But if an author immediately, you know, starts going through my history, or start doxing my home address, or start calling me, you know, all kinds of nasty things, or threatens to sue me, and all of this has happened, then that tells me that they don't have any data to take away my concern. It actually might mean that I'm right. So it makes me even more determined to look further into their papers, because I apparently have hit a nerve, and they are, you know, they're trying to divert the attention away from their paper towards all the bad things I might have done in my life, which is completely irrelevant, because the problem I'm raising is clearly visible from the paper. And, you know, I've been accused of conflicts of interest, or being paid by big pharma and or people with certain positions in stock, a certain stock by a certain biotech company. And that's not the case. That's all, you know, that's, even if I tell them 100 times I was not paid by them, they don't believe it. And they, you know, write Reddit posts about me and all kinds of nasty stuff, videos about me, accusing me of whatever, in the hopes, I guess, to discredit me. And luckily, I've had a lot of support by the scientific community, especially when I was threatened with a lawsuit. And that has strengthened me, and it helped me realize, well, there is no data that they can show. I should just, you know, I should, you know, not step aside, and I should keep on doing this, because I have a point and I've hit them where it hurts.
Oh, good for you. Is that the Raoul situation? Is that with the lawsuit? Yeah,
that's a French professor in who was you know, he's a very well published microbiologist, which is my own field. So I'm very aware of his work, and he has done great work in the past. And he sort of became more internationally known because during the start of the COVID-19 pandemic in March 2020, he claimed that hydroxychloroquine could treat patients with COVID-19. And he presented a small data set of 40 patients divided into 3 groups. And I found many problems with that paper. They weren't image related, but there were problems with there was no randomization. There were, iffy results, and I just did not have a good feeling about the paper and wrote a blog post about it. And he immediately started to call me all kinds of weird words. There was suddenly a whole, what seemed to be an organized group of Twitter followers by him who started to continuously attack me. And then after a year of doing that, then suddenly he said, "Oh, I'm going to sue you for harassment and extortion." And it wasn't really a sue. It was like a police report that he filed with the procureur in Marseille. So it's sort of a complaint that he filed. But he kept on saying, "No, we're going to sue you. We're going to sue you." And I'm like, okay, well, sue me. That I didn't say that, but that's sort of what I thought. Like, I'm not going to step aside and delete my Papier comments. I'm actually going to look into more of your papers. And I found more problems. So it encouraged me. So he has now, and other people joined that search. So he has now over 400 papers from his group on Papier that have problems.
Wow. I actually remember when that paper, the hydroxychloroquine paper came out. I think at the time it was still a preprint. We actually made a video at the time. This is 2020, right? We made a video about hydroxychloroquine, going over the evidence at the time, and I think we featured that preprint among other things. And yeah, there were a lot of concerns already about the experimental design.
Perhaps also because President Trump tweeted it, right. And he rarely tweeted about science, so that was quite a remarkable fact. And I don't think he has tweeted any science since then, but that was his only science moment, and he picked that paper, and he claimed to have taken hydroxychloroquine and it helped him. But yeah, and so lots of people actually, his tweet had so much effect. People were wanted to buy hydroxychloroquine. I think they bought. Somebody found out that it was in aquarium cleaners or so, and then people started to take pills of aquarium cleaners, and then a couple of people died taking that. It was just madness, just based on, on this paper.
You mentioned paper mills earlier, so maybe you can explain what a paper mill is for viewers who are not in this field, and what the story is with the paper mill. Was it 400 papers that got retracted or something like that?
Right. Oh, there's several paper mills. Yeah. So a paper mill, a scientific paper mill, is a set of papers. We use it to either describe a set of papers or the company that makes these papers. So there are companies that make falsified papers. Sometimes they have different models. Some have plagiarized papers that they synonymize. Some make fabricated papers based on a template with realistic looking photos that are probably real, but maybe taken from other papers. Sometimes we can find those source papers, sometimes we cannot. So there's different models, but they're all fabricated, or authors are added at the last moment, and the authors then pay for the authorship to the company. Basically, these are authors who need a paper. There are certain countries that have very strict regulations about authorship. So, for example, in China, if you are a medical doctor and you are not interested in research, those things don't always go together. So you just want to practice medicine let's say in a regional hospital, you still have to publish 1 or 2 papers to get a position. And these people are not given time off to do research, so they have to work, I assume, long hours in wards and shifts. And how do you write a scientific paper if you don't have time to do that? So they just buy an authorship, and these are apparently freely offered on social media sites like Weibo in China. And there are other countries like Russia where there also are, I'm less familiar with that, but there's also requirements for authorship. So yeah, when you put impossible measures on people, demands on people, then people are going to cheat to just tick the box and get that paper out.
I also heard on the topic of crazy stories, I also heard, or one of these interviews or one of these pieces about you, that somebody was caught perpetrating scientific fraud, and then somebody killed herself or himself. There was like a case of suicide.
In Japan, yes. So the case in Japan, I wasn't involved in that, but there was a woman doing research on stem cells, or making cells pluripotent.
Yeah.
And she claimed she could make them pluripotent by dipping them in acid. And her papers she got 2 or 3 papers, I think in Nature or Science or so published. And then other people noticed problems with the images. And so her papers got retracted after a long investigation. And then one of her co-authors, who was her mentor, he was like I think a director at the Riken Institute, he took his life. Yes. He was so embarrassed, like he said, I should have seen this and I should have caught this. And he felt he could not get out of that problem. Yes. So,
Yeah.
and I'm trying to be aware when I talk about misconduct that, you know, we can make fun sometimes of the images, like they're so photoshopped, you have to laugh almost. But I try to be respectful for the people behind the scenes. So I might occasionally name a name when it's pretty certain who did it, but all these cases have a sad story behind them. There's people who feel they need to, this is the only way out. They need to do misconduct in order to get a paper or an authorship or a position at a hospital, whatever. But also all their co-authors are dragged into these cases. You know, there might be one author on the paper who was responsible for the Photoshop or the plagiarism, and the other authors might not have known it. Maybe they could have suspected it, but yeah, we as scientists, we tend to trust each other, maybe sometimes too much, tend to be maybe a little bit naive. So it's not just the people who do the misconduct, it's all their co-authors and all the people working in that lab who might not be an author on that paper, but whose careers might also be damaged, and all the people in that institution. And so, and even the country, like these repercussions go sort of in waves beyond that one particular person or that one particular figure. It's so many people who are involved in that. There's several things we can do. I feel we need to take some of the pressure off of scientists. I feel a lot of pressure to publish, and people are just publishing papers just for the heck of publishing or so. There seems to be a tsunami of papers, and who can read all that stuff anymore? And papers are also getting more and more complex. So I hope we can go towards a system of more reproducibility, where we have, you know, you can just publish one figure or one experiment and then other people can reproduce it. Because in the end, reproducibility might be the only way we know that an experiment is real. You know, with artificial intelligence being able to do wonderful things, it can also create a lot of fake images or fake data. And right. I think we're at a point where we no longer can distinguish fake from real. So more reproducibility, smaller publication units, more checks at the scientific publishers. I feel scientific publishing has sort of grown into this, I don't know, like an enormous business that seemed to care, at least from my perspective, more about money than about integrity or quality of the data. It cost like, I think, $11,000 to get a paper published in Nature, and I'm not quite sure where that money goes to. One of my co-worker fellow detectives just found one yesterday or the day before that, found a paper with an image duplication in it. And there he's like, where does the $11,000 go to? It doesn't seem to go to quality control.
How does a journal like Nature not have automated, at least like some software? I would think a college student with some training in computer science could design a software that could, I'm not saying it would be perfect, but it could pick up, you know, 80% of gross duplications in images, like side by side, or something like that. It's crazy to me that a journal like Nature just lets something like that through.
The one I found was pretty complex. I saw it by eye immediately, but software was a little bit tougher. I could show it with software. I was not actually believed before I could show it with software, but this particular one that was just found was in the supplemental. So maybe that was not checked. I don't know.
You touched on reproducibility, which is something that we talk about ad nauseum in our videos. We always try to drill this into the viewers' heads that science hinges on reproducibility, because even leaving aside fraud and mistakes, I mean, there's always experiments. We both know, anybody who's worked in a lab knows, you run the same experiment 20 times, there's going to be a couple outliers. So yes. You go through a field where there's enormous consistency, you can find a study that goes in the opposite direction. That's always the case. And so, yeah, this question of reproducibility, I had specifically this question that I wanted to ask you is, to what extent do you think this is the key long term to protect ourselves from these issues of whether it's intentional manipulation or mistakes? At the end of the day, if something is seen over and over by different teams in different countries using independent complementary experimental approaches, that is ultimately the test of reliability, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And I hope we might, one of the dreams I have is that we cannot not just put the papers we published on our resume, but also the papers we have reproduced by others. So, and also be proud of papers that I wrote that other people have been reproducing. So I feel there should be 3 categories of papers on your resume, not just one, the ones you wrote, but the ones you wrote, the ones you reproduced, and the ones you wrote and were reproduced by others. So,
yeah.
And and so maybe graduate student in their first year of doing lab work could reproduce a paper. That could be an enormous source of reproduction, where, if everybody in their first year could do that, and it would count towards your PhD thesis, it would not be seen, as like, well, that work has already been done. No, it shows that the PhD candidate has a good sense of working in the lab, of organizing stuff around them to reproduce the paper, and it shows the other person that their work was reproducible. I feel that's a win-win situation. People are still learning how to do science at that stage, so might as well give them something a little bit easier than a completely new project. And I think that could be a fantastic resource of building in reproducibility as part of your PhD.
I'm wondering, what's your takeaway of all this? I mean, you see fraud, you see lies, you see deception all day long. You have these interactions with editors and scientists who aren't necessarily the most positive sides of human nature. Does this make you negative towards humanity, or do you see a silver lining? Do you see some lessons in all this?
Well, on some days it does, especially when I open my Twitter and see all negative comments. But no, in general, and I always end all my talks with that, like, don't walk away from this podcast thinking, or this video thinking that all science is flawed, because I'm working on a sliver of science that might not be good. But many of the things I'm finding are just errors. They're not necessarily misconduct. And the ones that are, those are the bad apples, but there's a lot of good fruit in the basket. And there's much more good fruit than the bad apple that I'm working on. There's and science is, for me, I'm 100% a scientist. I'm very enthusiastic about science, and I always say we need, there's so much bad things in the world. We have pollution, we have climate change, and we have pandemics, and we have, a lot of bad problems in our world, and we need science to solve these problems. That's the only way out. We need science. We need to believe in science. I believe in science, but we need science to also be reliable and good. So we need some people who do what I do to be a little bit critical of the things we think are wrong in science, but it's just meant to make science better. So that's, I hope, the message that people will take out of this. Don't focus on just the bad. There's a lot of good things. And I just love science, and I'll be a scientist my whole life.
I think you and your work are silver linings. Somebody who gave up their entire career, who had all of these incentives to continue on this track that would be a lot easier, and went and did this that is financially uncertain, where you get a lot of ungrateful reactions, and so clearly this is something that you do because you feel it's important, and a lot of people probably see as kind of cleanup, kind of a second-rate. It would not be happy to do it, and so the fact that you're doing all this and dedicating your life to this, to me, is one big silver lining, and one big sign that most scientists, the majority of scientists, mean really well. They are selfless, and they're very giving with their time and their effort.
Would you like to test your fraud detection skills? Elisabeth regularly posts puzzles to her popular Twitter account where her followers are challenged to spot the duplications and manipulations. With a little bit of practice and patience, anybody can do it. So I highly recommend following her there. I'll also include links in the description to her blog and her Patreon account. Please consider supporting her if you feel her work is valuable. Let us know your comments below. Take care. I'll see you next week.